They said the one-armed man rode in on a mule the color of old ash, and he carried his rifle in a scabbard cut special so a man with one hand could pull it loose without thinking. They said he did not drink. They said he did not lie. They said when he asked a question, you answered, because the eye that looked at you was the eye of a man who had already decided whether you were worth keeping alive. They said 6 ranchers laughed when he stepped down off that mule in front of the dry goods store in Sweet Bark, Wyoming, and asked after a widow named Hannah Pell. They said the laughter went on a long time. They said it stopped sudden, the way laughter stops when a snake drops into a card game, and it did not start again. And they said the deaf boy on the widow's porch, 8 years old, his hair the color of new wheat, watched the stranger come up the wagon road and did not run inside, and did not hide behind his mother's skirts, and did not cry. They said he stood very still, and his small mouth moved without sound, and he made one sign with his hands that nobody in that valley but his mother could read. But before we come to the boy, and before we come to the 6 ranchers who would learn whose son he had been, we must go back a little. We must go back to a brown afternoon in late October of 1886, when a man with one sleeve pinned at the shoulder rode into a country that had already decided he was nothing to fear. His name, as far as anyone in Sweet Bark would ever learn it, was Asa Coyle. He gave that name once to the boy at the livery, and then he did not give it again. He was 39 years old, though he looked older. His hair was gone gray at the temples. His face was burned brown and lined hard, like leather left out one winter too many. He wore a long, dark coat and a flat hat. The left sleeve of his coat was empty from the shoulder and pinned neatly with a brass pin, and he did not look at it, and he did not draw attention to it, and he did not apologize for it. He had left his right arm, his good arm, on the chest of a wounded sergeant outside Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, dragging the man out of a creek bed under fire, and he had left his left arm at a place in the Chiricahua Mountains in the autumn of 1876, in a brush with men who did not deserve naming. He had no left arm. He had the right one only. He had taught it to do everything a man's 2 hands could once do, and to do a few things they could not. He had a Henry rifle in a cut-down scabbard on the mule. He had a Colt revolver on his right hip, butt forward, in a holster sewn by a saddler in El Paso who had taken pity. He had a small Bible with a cracked black cover in his saddlebag, given to him by a chaplain at a field hospital where they had told him he would not live till morning. He had lived till morning. He had been living till morning a long time. He was not a man who sought trouble. He was not a man who chased glory. He was not a man who told his story. But there were people in this country who knew his story, and one of them had written him a letter. The letter had reached him in a town in the Texas Panhandle 6 weeks before. It was written in a careful schoolteacher hand on cheap paper, and it began with the words, "Mr. Coyle, you do not know me, but my husband knew you, and before he died, he told me that if ever I had nowhere left to turn, I was to find you." That was the first line. The second line said, "I have nowhere left to turn." The third line said, "My son and I are being driven off our land. They mean to starve us out before the first snow. The man who signs his name to this country is Wendell Brockton. Please come." The widow's name at the bottom of the letter was Hannah Pell. The husband she named, the husband who had told her where to send if the worst came, was a man Asa Coyle had served with in a place far from Wyoming, a man named Tom Pell. Tom Pell had died of a fever in a railroad camp in Colorado in the spring of 1883, and Asa had not known it until that letter came. He had read the letter twice and folded it and put it inside the Bible. He had saddled the mule the next morning. He had been 6 weeks on the road. Sweet Bark, Wyoming, when he came to it that October afternoon, was a town built along a single muddy street with a saloon at one end and a church at the other, and a long, crooked line of false front buildings in between, and it sat in a wide grass valley that was just beginning to brown out for the winter. There were mountains to the west, dark as bruises. There was a sky the color of cold iron. There were 6 big ranches in the valley, and they had names: the Diamond Bar, the /W, the Rocking K, the Twin Pines, the 76, the Brockton. The Brockton was the biggest of them. The Brockton sat at the head of the valley like a hand around a throat. The widow's place, 160 acres of good creek bottom with timber on the north slope, sat between the Brockton holding and the /W. It had belonged to Tom Pell and to his father before him, who had filed on it in 1868. It was, the six ranchers had agreed among themselves over whiskey one night at the Brockton Ranch House, the last unfenced piece in the valley, and it was theirs by right, and any sentiment otherwise was a woman's foolishness that would pass with hunger. Asa Coyle rode up to the dry goods store and stepped down off the mule. He looped the reins on the rail with one hand, a movement so practiced it looked like one motion, and he went up the warped steps and into the store. There were 5 men inside. 2 were behind the counter, the storekeeper, a thin man with spectacles, and a heavy-set clerk. 3 were customers, leaning on barrels. They were big men, sun-browned, in good boots and good hats, and they wore their guns easy. They had been laughing at something when Asa came in. They stopped laughing and looked at him. They looked at the empty sleeve. One of them smiled and looked at the other 2, and the other 2 smiled also. Asa took off his hat. "I'm looking for the place of Mrs. Hannah Pell," he said. His voice was quiet and unhurried. The storekeeper opened his mouth. The biggest of the 3 customers spoke first. He was a sandy-haired man with a thick neck, and he wore a silver pin on his vest in the shape of a bar across a diamond. "What business you got with the widow Pell?" he said. "My own," said Asa. The sandy-haired man looked at the empty sleeve again. He let his eyes go up and down the whole man, and he smiled wider, and he said, "Mister, we don't get many one-armed pilgrims through Sweetbark. You a preacher? You here to bring the widow comfort?" "I'm here to bring her what she sent for," said Asa. The other 2 customers laughed at that. The sandy-haired man did not laugh. He looked at the gun on Asa's hip, butt forward on the right, and his smile lost a little something. But he held it. "Well," he said, "you go on out south of town about 4 miles. You'll see a creek and a stand of cottonwoods. There's a sod-roofed cabin under them. That's the Pell place. You give her our regards, mister. You tell her Wendell Brockton sends his regards, and tell her his offer stands until the first snow, and tell her the first snow's coming early this year." "I will tell her you said so," said Asa. He put his hat back on. He turned. He went out. He did not hurry. He untied the mule. He swung up, and he rode south down the muddy street, and behind him in the dry goods store the 3 men were quiet for a moment, and then the sandy-haired one laughed once, a short, hard sound, and said, "A one-armed man. She has sent for a one-armed man," and the laughter started again behind him as he rode out of Sweetbark. He heard it. He did not look back. He had heard laughter like that before. He knew the sound the laughter made when it stopped. The widow's place was where the rancher had said it would be. A creek ran shallow over stones. A stand of cottonwoods, their leaves gone yellow, stood along the bank. The cabin was sod-roofed and small, with a stovepipe leaning out of one end. There was a pole corral half fallen down. There was a thin coil of smoke from the chimney that meant fire, but not much fire. He saw the boy first. The boy was standing on the porch step. He was 8 years old, thin in the way frontier children are thin, with hair the color of new wheat and very serious gray eyes. He wore a man's wool coat cut down to fit him, and the cuffs were turned back twice. He saw the mule come up the road, and he did not move, and he did not call out. He stood very still and watched, and after a moment he made a small sign with his right hand against the palm of his left, the way a person might pat down a bird that wanted to fly. Asa stopped the mule at the corral. He raised his right hand, open, fingers spread. He held it there a long moment so the boy could see it. Then he lowered it slow. The cabin door opened. A woman stepped out behind the boy. She was perhaps 30 years old. She had brown hair pulled back severe at the nape of her neck, and a face that had been pretty once and was now drawn thin and gone hard around the eyes, the way a face goes when a person has been sleeping poorly and eating less. She wore a gray wool dress that had been patched at the elbows. She had a single-shot rifle in her hands, held across her body, not pointed, not lowered. "Mister," she said, "I don't know you." "My name is Asa Coyle," he said. He did not get down. "You wrote me a letter, ma'am." She did not move for a moment. Then her face changed. It did not soften. There was no softening left to do. But something behind her eyes shifted, the way a curtain shifts when a wind comes through a cracked window. She lowered the rifle and leaned it against the doorframe. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy looked up at her, and she made a small sign with her free hand, fingers brushing her cheek and then opening flat. The boy looked back at Asa. He did not smile, but he stopped being afraid. "You came," the widow said. She said it the way a person says a thing they had not let themselves believe. "I came," said Asa. He stepped down off the mule. He led it to the corral. The widow watched him with her hand still on the boy's shoulder, and the boy watched him too. And when Asa came back across the yard with a saddlebag over his right shoulder, she said, "Come in, mister. We've got coffee. We haven't got much else." He went in. The cabin was one room. There was a stove in the corner with a small, bright fire going in it, more for company than for warmth. There was a plank table, a bed in the corner with a quilt over it, a smaller bed under the window for the boy. There was a shelf with a few books on it, a Bible, a primer, a fat brown book that looked like it might be Pilgrim's Progress, and a slim school reader. There was a sampler on the wall that said in neat cross-stitch, "The Lord is my shepherd." There was a daguerreotype on the mantel of a young man in a dark coat with a serious mouth and a gentle eye. Asa looked at the daguerreotype, and he looked at the boy, and he looked away. "That's Tom," the widow said. She had seen him look. "I know," said Asa. She poured him coffee from a tin pot on the stove. The coffee was thin and weak. They had been stretching the grounds, but it was hot, and she set it in front of him with a small dignity that did not let on. The boy sat on a stool by the stove and watched Asa with the steady gray eyes. "His name is Eli," the widow said. "He was 3 years old when the fever took his hearing. He hears nothing now, not a wagon, not a shot, not a wolf. He reads our hands and he reads our lips. He is the smartest child in this valley, mister, and there is not a soul in Sweetbark who is bothered to learn what his hands say but his mother." "I'll learn," said Asa. She looked at him a long time. Then she sat down across from him at the plank table. She folded her hands. She said, "Mr. Coyle, Tom told me about you before he died. He told me that there was a man in Texas who owed him nothing and who would come if I called. He told me that man would come even on one good leg." She paused. "He didn't tell me about your arm." "He didn't know," said Asa. "I lost it after." "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not," said Asa. "It would not have come off if I had been a worse man, and I would not be here. Tell me about Brockton." She told him. She told him in a quiet, even voice, the way a woman tells a thing she has gone over so many times in her own head that the words come out smooth. Wendell Brockton owned the biggest ranch in the valley. He had 5 neighbors who ran the other big places: Calder of the /W, Wheeler of the Rocking K, Hammond of the Twin Pines, Greer of the 76, and a 6th man named Pike, who held no land of his own but ran Brockton's hired guns. And the 6 of them, as far as Hannah Pell could tell, had decided 2 summers back that the valley would be theirs entire. They had bought out 2 homesteaders. They had run off a 3rd with a barn fire that the sheriff in Sweetbark, who was Brockton's cousin, had called an act of God. They had offered Hannah Pell $300 for the 160 acres that her husband's father had filed on. She had refused. They had offered her $200. She had refused. They had offered her $100. She had refused that, too. After that, the cattle had begun. Brockton's cattle, and Calder's, and Wheeler's would push through her broken fences in the night and trample her garden. Her milk cow had been driven off and not come back. Her chickens had been taken twice. 3 weeks ago, a hired man, she thought it was Pike's man, but she could not swear to it, had ridden up to the cabin in the middle of the night and shot her dog through the window. The dog had been an old yellow hound that Tom Pell had raised from a pup. The dog had died on the porch with its head in Eli's lap, and Eli had not made a sound, because Eli could not make a sound, but he had not stopped crying for 2 days, dry-eyed by the 2nd day, just shaking. The first snow was coming. They had a little flour. They had a little salt pork. They had no money. They had nowhere to go. Hannah Pell had a brother in St. Louis who would have taken her in, but the brother's wife had written her last spring that the brother had been dead for 2 years and the wife had no room. Hannah Pell had not told anybody in Sweet Bark that. She had let them believe she still had somewhere. "I have a place," she said, "and I have a boy, and I do not have one more thing. Mr. Coyle, I will not say I am not afraid, but I will not be driven. Tom filed on this ground. Tom is buried in that grove of cottonwoods out there. Eli was born in that bed. I will not be driven." Asa Coyle listened. He drank the thin coffee. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he sat very still for a moment, and then he turned his head and looked at the boy, who was still watching him, steady and grave. "Ma'am," he said, "do I have your leave to stay on the place a while?" "You have my leave," she said. "Then I'll need a bedroll on the floor by the stove," he said. "And I'll need to look at your fences in the morning, and I'll need to ride out tomorrow afternoon and let it be known in town that I am stopping here. After that, we'll see what the 6 of them mean to do." "Mr. Coyle," she said, "there are 6 of them, and you—" She stopped herself. "And I have one arm," he said. "Yes, ma'am, I have one arm. I have noticed." He smiled when he said it. It was the first smile any of them in the cabin had seen out of him, and it was a small smile, and it did not last long. But the boy saw it, and the boy's gray eyes shifted, and the boy made a small sign with his hands. Hannah Pell, watching, drew in her breath. "What did he say?" Asa asked. She had to clear her throat before she could answer. "He said," she said, "that you have the same eyes as his father." That night, Asa Coyle slept on a folded blanket on the puncheon floor by the stove, with his coat for a pillow and the Colt revolver in easy reach by his right hand. He slept light, the way a man sleeps who has slept light for 20 years. Once, around 3 in the morning, he heard a horse a long way off down the creek, and he sat up, and he listened, and the horse went on by and did not come closer, and he lay back down. In the morning, he was up before the sky was light. He stoked the stove. He started water for coffee. When Hannah Pell came out from behind the curtain that separated her corner of the cabin, her hair pulled back, her face still soft with sleep, she stopped and looked at him at the stove, and something crossed her face she did not let stay, and she said only, "Mr. Coyle, you did not need to." "I did need to," he said. The boy came out then, in his nightshirt, hair sticking up. He saw Asa at the stove. He came over and stood beside him and looked up. Asa, slow, deliberate, made a sign with his right hand, the only sign he had remembered from a Crow scout he had ridden with in '74. He pressed the flat of his palm to his own chest and then opened it out toward the boy. "Heart, to you." The boy looked at the sign. The boy made it back. Hannah Pell turned her face to the window so neither of them would see. He spent that morning walking the fences. The fences were bad. Half the posts were rotted at the ground line. The wire had been cut in 3 places that were not natural cuts. He found cattle sign through every break, big steers, shod tracks of riders along with them. He found in one place by the creek, a place where a man had stood off his horse and pissed on the woodpile. He stood looking at the woodpile a long moment. Then he went back to the cabin. "I will go to town this afternoon," he said. "I'll buy posts, I'll buy wire. I'll buy a sack of beans and a side of bacon and what oats they have, and I will let it be known I am here." "Mr. Coyle," she said. He had taken a small leather pouch from inside his coat, and he set it on the table. He opened it. There were gold pieces in it. Not a fortune, but enough. "I have been a long time saving for a quiet place," he said. "If you can use this, ma'am, it is yours. If you cannot, it sits there and waits." She looked at the gold for a long time. She did not touch it. She said, "Mr. Coyle, I am a proud woman. I have been proud a long time, and pride has cost me. I will use it. I will pay you back somehow, before God." "You owe me nothing," he said. "I owe your husband. He carried me half a mile through a creek bed in '63. There is not gold enough on this earth to pay a thing like that." She put her hand over the small leather pouch. She did not speak. He rode into Sweetbark that afternoon on the ash-colored mule. He went to the dry goods store. The storekeeper looked at him over the spectacles and did not speak. Asa laid the gold on the counter and named what he wanted: posts, wire, staples, a keg of nails, oats, beans, bacon, salt, flour, 2 pounds of coffee, and a small tin of hard candy. The storekeeper looked at the gold, and looked at the empty sleeve, and looked at the gun on the man's right hip, and went into the back to fetch the goods. The 3 men from the day before were not in the store. There were 4 different men in the store. They were quieter than yesterday's. They watched Asa from the corner of their eyes, and they did not speak to him. When the storekeeper came back, sweating a little, Asa paid him and asked him plain, "Friend, do you know a man in this town goes by Pike?" The storekeeper went the color of paste. "Mister, I don't." "You do," said Asa.
Tell him when you see him that there is a man stopping at the Pell place who knew Tom Pell, and that man is willing to see anyone, any morning, on the porch between the hours of 7 and 9. After that, he is busy with the fences. Tell him that, friend. Tell Mr. Brockton, too, if you should happen to see him. "Mister," whispered the storekeeper. "Mister, you don't know." "I know," said Asa. He loaded the goods on a buckboard he had hired from the livery for $2. He drove the buckboard out of town with the ash-colored mule tied behind. At the edge of town, a man stepped out into the road in front of him. It was Pike. Pike was younger than Asa, maybe 35, lean and brown and quick-looking, with a black mustache trimmed down close and a gray hat pulled low. He wore 2 guns. He smiled when Asa pulled up the buckboard. "Mister," said Pike, "I hear you've been making free with my name in there." "I asked after you by name," said Asa. "That isn't free." "I hear you got a notion to set up at the Pell place." "I have set up there," said Asa. Pike looked at the buckboard. He looked at the empty sleeve. He smiled wider. "Mister," he said, "you do not understand the country you have come into. You ride out tomorrow morning. I will not ask twice." "You have not asked once," said Asa. "You have told. There is a difference. As for tomorrow morning, I will be on the Pell porch between the hours of 7 and 9. You come if you wish to. Come alone or come with the other 5. It is the same to me." Pike's smile did not go away. It changed. It went thin and tight and lost its humor. He stepped back from the buckboard. He said, "One arm, mister. One arm." "Yes," said Asa. "I have been told." He drove on out of town. That night, in the cabin, with the new sack of beans and the new side of bacon on the shelf, Hannah Pell cooked the first meal that any of them had eaten in 3 weeks that smelled like a meal. Beans and bacon, salt and pepper, a pan of cornbread out of the oven, hot, with the crust gold. Eli ate 2 helpings. He did not look up from the plate. When he was done, he put the plate aside and came to where Asa sat on the bench and stood beside him, and he leaned, very slow, against Asa's good arm. Asa did not move. He did not put his arm around the boy. He sat very still, and he closed his eye for a moment, and then he opened it, and he looked across the table at Hannah Pell, and her face was wet, and she did not bother to wipe it. She said, "Mr. Coyle, I have not had a man at this table in 3 years." "I know," he said. "He loved you," she said. "Tom, he spoke of you only twice in our marriage, and both times with that quiet way a man has when a thing is too big to make small with words. He said you were the best man he had ever known under fire. He said when you came home you would be a hard man to live near and a fine man to die near. He said, if ever I had nowhere left, I was to send for you, and you would come, even on one arm or one leg, or with the breath rattling in you." I did not believe him. "I am sorry, mister. I am ashamed I did not believe him." "Ma'am," said Asa, "you wrote the letter. You believed him enough." Eli had fallen asleep, leaning against Asa's arm. Asa did not move. Hannah Pell got up, very quiet, and came around the table and lifted the boy with the practiced strength of a woman who has carried a sleeping child 1,000 times, and carried him to the small bed under the window and tucked the quilt around him. She came back to the table. She sat down. She looked across at Asa Coyle. "Will they come tomorrow?" she said. "Some of them will come," he said. "What will you do?" "I will speak to them first," he said. "I will tell them, in the daylight, on this porch, what I am. I will give them their chance to ride off. If they do not ride off, I will do what I have to do." I do not seek to kill any man, ma'am. I have done enough of it. But I will not have this place taken, and I will not have you and the boy driven, and I will not have your husband's grave plowed under for a feedlot. That is the size of it." "Mr. Coyle," she said, "there will be 6 of them." "There will be fewer of them than that," he said quietly, "before there are more." She did not understand the line then. She would understand it later. They came in the morning, but not all of them, and not at 7. They came at 10, after Asa had begun work on the fences. They came along the creek road in a loose group of 4. Pike was riding at the head on a tall black horse. Behind him rode Wendell Brockton himself, the sandy-haired man from the store, big and broad on a sorrel. With them were 2 other men, a heavy man with a red face that Asa took to be Calder, and a leaner, older man with a white mustache that he took to be Greer. The other 2 ranchers, Wheeler and Hammond, had not come. They had stayed home. That was, Asa knew, the first crack. He had time to set down the post-hole digger and walk back to the cabin and step up onto the porch. Hannah Pell stood in the doorway behind him with the single-shot rifle. The boy stood beside her, his small back straight, his gray eyes on the 4 riders, and he did not move, and he did not look up at his mother for direction. He had decided already to be a man this morning. He was 8. The 4 riders pulled up in the yard. Brockton sat his sorrel and looked at Asa Coyle on the porch. "Mister," he said in a tone of mild and dignified reasoning, "I am Wendell Brockton. I run the big outfit up the valley. I came out here as a courtesy, sir. I came out to ask you, neighbor to neighbor, why a one-armed pilgrim from out of country has put himself between my outfit and a piece of ground I am about to acquire." "Mr. Brockton," said Asa, "you are not about to acquire it. You are about to ride off it." Brockton smiled the smile he had smiled in the store. "Sir," he said, "you have not even asked my price." "I do not need to," said Asa. "It is not for sale." "Everything is for sale," said Brockton. "This is not," said Asa. The man with the red face, Calder, leaned forward in his saddle and laughed. "Wendell," he said, "this man's got 1 arm. He's going to talk us off?" Asa Coyle looked at Calder. He looked at him a long moment until the laugh died on the man's face, which it did. Then he looked back at Brockton. "Mr. Brockton," he said, "there is a thing you do not know. I am going to tell it to you now because it is owed to you, and because once it is told, there will be no putting it back. The woman in this doorway is the widow of Thomas Pell. The boy on this porch is the son of Thomas Pell. You did not know Thomas Pell. You never met him. You came into this country after he died, so you think there is no one to answer for the widow and the boy. You think the boy is just a deaf child on a poor place, and the woman is just a stubborn woman, and you can have them out before snow." "Mister," said Brockton, "I have not asked for a sermon." "You will hear it," said Asa. "Thomas Pell rode with me, and with 17 other men, between the years of 73 and 76, in country south of here. Thomas Pell was the finest scout and the quietest gun in the territory. There is a marshal in Denver and another in Cheyenne and a colonel retired in Fort Leavenworth who will write you a letter and tell you what Thomas Pell was. He laid down the gun in 77. He came north. He married this woman. He died of a railroad fever before his son was 4. He left his wife and his boy on this 160 acres of creek bottom, and he left them with one thing he never told them. He left them with a friend." Brockton's smile was gone now. "He left them with me," said Asa Coyle. "Now you 4, and the 2 who did not come, you have a choice. You will ride off this land, today, before the sun is over the ridge, and you will not come back. And you will leave this woman and this boy to plant their corn and milk their cow and bury their dead. Or you will not. If you will not, then there are 6 of you, and there is 1 of me, and I have 1 arm. And I will tell you something for free, gentlemen, that you have not earned. I have 1 arm, and I am the second best gun that ever rode out of the Chiricahuas. The best was Thomas Pell. Thomas Pell taught me, and what Thomas Pell taught me has not gone anywhere." The yard was very quiet. Pike, on the black horse, had gone still.
His hand was near his gun, but it was not on it. He had heard, somewhere down the long whisper of the country, the name he was hearing now. He had not put it together with the one-armed man because nobody had told him to put it together. He was putting it together now.
Brockton's face had gone the color of cold tallow. He said, "Pike, he is bluffing. There are 4 of us. He has 1 arm." "Mr. Brockton," said Pike, slow, "he is not bluffing. He is one man." "He is one man," said Pike, "and there is a graveyard in Tucson with 11 stones in it that says he is one man we ought to ride off and leave alone." "Pike!" "Mr. Brockton," said Pike, "you brought me up here to run sodbusters off creek bottoms. You did not bring me up here to die on a porch in front of a deaf child for a piece of ground you do not even need. I am going to ride off this place. You can come with me, or you can stay. I do not care which, but I am going." He turned the black horse. He did not look at Asa Coyle again. He rode out of the yard at a walk, not a trot, not a gallop, but a walk, which is the hardest pace for a man to ride when he has just been put down. He went down the creek road, and he did not look back. Calder looked at Greer.
Greer's white mustache was trembling. He had not spoken once. He turned his horse, and he rode after Pike, and Calder, after a long moment in which his red face went redder and then went white, turned too and followed. Brockton was alone in the yard. He sat the sorrel and looked up at the porch. "This is not over," he said. "Mr. Brockton," said Asa Coyle, "you have until first dark to be off the road that touches this fence line. After that I will consider you a trespasser, and I will treat you as one. You take that to your 2 friends who did not have the courage to come this morning. You tell them what you heard. You tell them what their hired gun did. And you tell them, when you have all sat down together with your whiskey, that the boy on this porch is Tom Pell's son, and I am Tom Pell's brother, before God if not before law, and any man who rides at this house rides at me." Brockton opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned the sorrel, and he rode out of the yard. Asa Coyle stood on the porch a long time after he was gone. He did not move. The boy beside him made a small sign with his hands. Hannah Pell, behind him in the doorway, made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else. "What did he say?" Asa said, without turning. "He said," said Hannah Pell, "that you said your name was Asa. He said his father's name was Thomas. He said now he has 2 names to say at night instead of 1. Asa Coyle closed his eye. He did not turn around. He felt the boy's small shoulder against his ribs through the coat. He stood like that a while, and the sun came up over the ridge. It was not over. Brockton did not give up that day, or the next. He sent a man, not Pike, who had drawn his pay and ridden south, and not Greer and not Calder, who had both separately sent their riders home that night, but a different man on the 3rd night who tried to fire the haystack. The haystack did not burn because Asa Coyle had soaked it in the afternoon and was waiting in the cottonwoods with the Henry rifle. The man went away again with a hole in his hat and a story to tell. He told the story in Sweet Bark the next afternoon. By evening, Brockton's hired men had begun, one by one, to come up to the bunkhouse door and draw their pay. By the end of the week, Brockton had 5 men left out of 26. By the end of the month, he had 2. By Christmas, he had sold 3,000 acres on the upper end of his holding to a syndicate out of St. Paul, and he had moved into a smaller house on what remained, and he did not ride past the Pell place anymore, and when he came into town, he came in alone, and he did not laugh. The other ranchers, the 4 who were left, Calder, Wheeler, Hammond, Greer, came one by one over that winter, hat in hand, to the Pell porch. They came alone, and they came in daylight. Calder came first. He sat on the step, and he said to Asa Coyle, "Mister, I have a wife and 3 children, and I was a fool. I would like to be a neighbor, if you will have one." Asa Coyle did not say yes, and he did not say no. He said, "Mr. Calder, you go on home, and you mend your own fences for a year, and we will see in the spring." Calder went home. He mended his fences. In the spring, Asa Coyle rode over to his place with a barrel of nails and helped him put a new roof on his barn. Calder cried when he saw the wagon come up the road. He did not let Asa see him cry. Asa did not let on that he had seen. That is how it was over the winter. The snow came. It came hard, as Brockton had threatened, and early, but it came and found the cabin chinked, and the woodpile high, and the larder stocked, and the cow back in the shed. Calder had brought the cow back, on the second day after his visit, leading it on a rope, saying nothing, only handing the rope to Hannah Pell on the porch and tipping his hat.
The boy named the cow Patience. In the long evenings, Asa Coyle sat by the stove and let Eli teach him signs. The boy was patient with him. Eli had names with his hands for every animal on the place, for every tool, for the weather, for the colors. He had a name for his mother that was a small motion of fingers across the heart. He had a name for Asa at first that was simply the sign for man with one arm, plain and descriptive. After a month, he changed it. The new sign was a flat right hand laid against the chest, then opened outward. It was the sign Asa had made him on the second morning. It was the sign for given heart. After that, Eli would not call him by any other name. In December, on the night of the first big storm, with the wind screaming around the eaves and the snow erasing the world, Hannah Pell sat down by the stove across from Asa Coyle, and they did not speak for a long time. Then she said, quiet, "Mr. Coyle, I will not ask you to stay."
I am not a woman who asks a thing she has no right to, but I will say that if you go in the spring when the road is clear, the boy will not understand it, and neither will I. He sat with his coffee in his right hand. He looked into the stove. "Ma'am," he said, "I was not planning to go." She did not look at him. She looked at the stove also. After a while, she said, "Then there is a thing I would have you know. I will not be married for protection. I have lived afraid, and I have lived alone, and afraid is the worse of the two, but alone is not so bad as it is said to be. If you stay because you wish to, not because you owe Tom anything. You have paid Tom what you owed, and twice over." "Ma'am," he said, "I will not stay for Tom. I will stay for you, if you will have me, and for the boy. I would like to stay for the boy." She closed her eyes. She did not say yes that night. She did not need to. He saw the answer on her face. They were married in the spring, on a clear blue morning in May of 1887, by a circuit-riding preacher named Hollis, who came up from Cheyenne. There was no big wedding. There was no fine dress. Hannah Pell, who became Hannah Coyle, wore the gray wool dress she had worn that first day, but she had let her hair down out of its hard knot, and there was a sprig of mountain sage tucked behind her ear, and she stood on the porch with her hand in Asa Coyle's right hand, and Eli stood beside them and held the Bible open for the preacher because the preacher had no place to set it down. Calder and his wife came, and Greer and his daughter, and the storekeeper from town, who had grown into a man in the past winter, and the schoolteacher from Sweetbark, a woman named Miss Avery, who had, on her own and unasked, ridden out 3 days a week through the winter to teach Eli to read and to learn his signs herself, and who would, in a year, marry the storekeeper. Wendell Brockton did not come. Wendell Brockton was not invited. There is one more thing worth saying. Some years later, on a hot afternoon in July of 1893, a young man came up the creek road on a wagon. He was a drummer of sewing machines out of Chicago, and he had taken a wrong road, and he was tired and hot and lost, and he stopped at the Pell place, for so it was still called, though everyone in the valley by then said the Coyle place too, to ask the way to Sweetbark and to beg a drink of water. He was given a drink and a slice of bread with honey and the way to town, and he sat on the porch for 10 minutes in the shade and talked with the man of the house, who had one sleeve pinned at the shoulder and a quiet, slow way of speaking. There was a thin, fair-headed boy of about 15, the drummer told it later, who came out of the barn with a colt on a lead rope, and the boy and the man spoke to each other in a language the drummer did not understand, with their hands, and the man laughed at something the boy said, and the boy grinned. There was a woman in the doorway with a baby on her hip, and the baby had her dark hair and her grave gray eyes, and the woman called the man Asa, and the man called the woman Hannah, and they spoke to each other with the kind of plain, easy fondness that people speak with when they have come up out of a hard place together, and the place has gone behind them, and the road is open.
The drummer, before he climbed back up on the wagon, mentioned, with the casual, idle wonder of a man passing through, that he had heard a story in Cheyenne about a one-armed gunfighter who had once cleared 6 ranchers out of a Wyoming valley in a single autumn. And was it true that such a man had lived in this country, and did the gentleman know of him? The man on the porch, the drummer said later, looked at the boy with the colt, and the boy looked back at him, and the man smiled a slow, small smile and said only, "Mister, I have heard the story too, but you ought to know it was never about the arm. It was about whose son the boy was." The drummer did not understand that, and he drove away to Sweetbark, and he forgot it by Christmas. But the people of the valley did not forget. They tell the story still in Sweetbark and in Cheyenne and in the bunkhouses of the Calder Ranch and the Greer Ranch and the houses that stand now on what was once Wendell Brockton's land. They tell how 6 ranchers laughed at a one-armed man on the steps of a dry goods store one October afternoon, and how 4 of them lived to be his neighbors, and one of them sold his outfit and died small in a back room behind a saloon in Laramie, and one of them, Pike, the hired gun, was last heard of riding south for the border, alone, the way a man rides when he has at last had the sense to be afraid in time. They tell how a woman who had been called stubborn and a fool and worse by men who wanted her ground was the woman to whom a soldier's last word had been entrusted, and how that word had walked 6 weeks across the country on the back of an ash-colored mule and come to her door. They tell how a deaf boy, who had been called less than whole by people who could neither hear him nor understand him, was the truest, sharpest-eyed witness in that whole valley, and how he grew up to be a man people sent for when they needed a thing done quietly and right, and how he never did learn to speak with his mouth, but spoke instead with his hands and his eyes, and was understood by every soul in the country who mattered, and not understood by the others, which was, in the end, no loss. And they tell, mostly, the lesson of the thing. They say that the world looked at a one-armed man and saw a cripple and laughed and was wrong. They say the world looked at a worn widow on a sod-roofed cabin and saw an easy mark and was wrong. They say the world looked at a deaf child on a porch and saw a burden and was wrong on every count, because the boy was Tom Pell's son, and there was a soldier somewhere out in the country who had loved Tom Pell, and the soldier was coming, and there was no laughter loud enough in any saloon in Sweetbark to drown the sound of him coming. They say that what the world calls a missing arm is sometimes only the place where God has rested his own hand. They say what the world calls a curse is sometimes the gift the world was not ready to receive. They say that the smallest, quietest house in a long valley can hold more strength than the biggest ranch on the highest ridge, if the right names sleep under its roof. And they say when the wind comes down off the mountains in October and rolls along the creek where the cottonwoods still stand, that you can almost hear, if you listen, a man on a porch teaching a boy a sign with his one good hand. The sign is a flat palm pressed to the chest and then opened, slow, outward, into the air. The boy is laughing without sound. The man is not laughing. The man is only smiling, small and steady, the way a man smiles who has come home at last to a place he did not know he was looking for, and found a wife and a son waiting on the porch, and a debt paid, and a long road ended, and a quiet that was, after all the noise of his life, the only thing he had ever truly wanted. That is the story. That is the whole of it. And if ever, in your own life, you find yourself laughed at on a porch by men who count your worth in the number of your arms, or the sound of your voice, or the size of your house, remember the one-armed man in the Wyoming Valley, and the deaf boy beside him, and the widow in the doorway with the rifle, and the 6 who laughed. Remember whose son the boy was, and remember, friend, that there is always, always someone coming up the road.